How did I beat you?
You may remember from The Matrix, Morpheus is trying to train Neo. When he fights him, the point isn't to show he's better, it's to try to get Neo to not only rise to the challenge, but for Neo, who Morpheus believes in, for Neo to reach his potential. I'm trying to do the same, to get you to reach your potential, because I believe in you. Not all of you, of course, just those of you who get it. Those who, like Neo, sense that there's something wrong with the world.
You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there.
And we need better eyes, better thinking to sense it.
Playing for? Yeah.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So instead of telling you, I told you so, I told you this regarding Jay Slater, I showed you that, I want to turn you into authentic fishermen, fishers of truth, to know outcomes before they are known, to know how to think about things ahead of others. To do this, we must acknowledge what we don't want. And what we don't want is to continue falling mindlessly down rabbit holes. Or do we? Do we want to continue falling mindlessly through rabbit holes?
What is the Matrix? Control. The Matrix is a computer-generated dream world, built to keep us under control in order to change a human being into this.
Do you want to be a zombie? Do you want to be a mindless person out there in the world whose strings are being pulled by others? Do you want to be mindless or mindful? Do you want to have your mind filled with someone else's mind, someone else's thoughts, or your own?
Do you believe in fate, Neil?
No,
Why not?
because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
One of the reasons I decided to become a journalist was I didn't like seeing people who thought they knew what they were talking about influencing other people who also thought they knew who this person was talking about. I didn't like people misleading other people, and I thought I would try to kind of address that. And I see it still happening. If anything, it's gotten worse. And so instead of being mindless, we want to be mindful. And we don't want someone else's wrong thinking in our minds. We want our own right thinking that suits our mind, that suits our lives. And so instead of slipping and sliding down slides custom made for us, either by cynical opportunists or by other mindless delusionists, what if we developed our own set of critical thinking skills, not only for these cases, but for our own lives and for our own world? Incidentally, I wasn't always a critical thinker myself, or even a very coherent thinker. I've made mistakes. I've gone down the wrong path. Once upon a time, I thought in a mishmash of rational and emotional ways. It took a while to organize my thinking. I thought in a conglomerate, I guess, of transference and through the filters of beliefs. Very little of our own thinking is our own thinking, if you think about it. And that needs to change. How did I become a critical thinker? Well, through the process of writing about 100 books. Then you have to think critically, you have to think effectively. And through the process of writing all of these books, you learn how to think. You learn how to think in a structured way. You learn how to think in an organized way. You learn how to think in a sensible way and in a logical way. Now, I'm sure you, like Neo, are already a critical thinker in some areas, but we need to awaken the dormant capacities. I've done that with myself. I want to encourage you to do the same. Because even if you learn to think properly, thinking alone is not enough.
Sometimes, MacLeod, the sharpest blade is not enough.
So even if you've sharpened your thinking to the sharpest blade, it's not going to be enough, right? Neo, you may remember, wakes up and learns to live actionably and effectively rather than simply thinking critically. He puts that critical thinking into motion, and his whole life changes. His whole perspective changes. His whole world changes, and what he does changes. We must do the same. And so, without further ado, here's the code-breaking toolbox for a missing persons case. But one can apply the same thing to any question, any problem, any scenario involving uncertainty that requires a solution, including your own life. What do you need to be doing? What do you need to be doing in this situation? How should you approach this or that? Before we get to that, just a reminder that I'll be doing a special final live stream on the J. Slater case tomorrow around about this time that this video was posted, addressing your best and worst questions and comments regarding this case. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do, especially after watching this. If it reaches you, touches you, maybe it is time that you started, filling your mind with edifying and sensible thoughts and ideas rather than silly things. So if you haven't subscribed, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. If you're still feeling very put off by the horrible analysis here, you can try and find the no thanks button, and let's get started. So the code-breaking toolbox, the TCRS code-breaking toolbox. These are 8 things you need to be paying attention to. If you don't have a notebook, maybe you should go and get one quickly. If you do, open it, click your pen, and let's get started. Number 1, statistics. Statistics are arguably the most underutilized tool in true crime, and what I see more often than not is even when you highlight them, people ignore them or dismiss them out of hand. And this really does show how selective people are with reality. That doesn't suit what I think. I'll just ignore that and see what happens. In this case, in literally all the dimensions where statistical probabilities were tested, they proved to be portentous. For example, we looked at crime stats in Tenerife and saw that these were essentially irrelevant because Tenerife has amongst the lowest crime rates in Europe. And despite that, we saw some hyper-focus on crime, on drug gangs. I saw one of the most ridiculous comments basically presenting the opposite view, that there's serious criminal activity going on in the south of Spain involving drug cartels and the mafia. Are you telling me that Tenerife and the Canary Islands are the south of Spain?
Are you out of your fucking mind?
And so we saw people going out of their way to try and make this unrealistic element of foul play, of criminal activity front and center when it was never to begin with. The statistics showed that. But that became dominated by people's feelings, people's emotions, people's excitement about the counter-narrative. Then the next thing, we also examined stats for national parks. Very boring stuff. And we saw that most deaths occur in parks with high mountains and from falls. That's precisely what occurred here. Remote, non-access controlled parks involving high mountains. That's exactly what occurred here. Not very exciting stuff. Let's just ignore that. Then the final dimension we looked at in terms of statistics were cases of other tourists who had gone missing in Tenerife, and how many of these cases involved foul play. How many of these cases involved drug mafias and drug underworlds, drug crime lords and crime bosses. Well, we saw that the majority didn't even involve foul play. Now, statistics aren't the answer. Statistics won't tell you the truth, but they point you in the general direction of what's probable. In other words, it's a guideline. Even so, there could be a blind spot, and so stats must be seen and measured in combination with other evidence, starting with the best evidence. And that brings us to number 2, best evidence. What is the best evidence? In hindsight, what was the best evidence in this case? I would say it was the ping. The final piece of information we had on Jay was the best. Where he was last before he disappeared. And so where he was last is actually telling you where he was. And so isn't that the best place to start searching for him? Now, it didn't help that some speculated that the phone was thrown to this ping point, which is another way of saying, let's not pay attention to the best evidence. Intuitively speaking, some of the best evidence was also the fact that the dogs weren't able to be of more use. In other words, the best evidence was that there was not evidence, that something where you would expect a result, there simply wasn't a result. And so in a scenario where the dogs absolutely ought to have had no trouble following Jay, they did have trouble. Why? Why couldn't they find him? Why couldn't they follow him? Well, because where Jay was also inaccessible to the dogs. That was a big clue that ought to have offered everyone valuable insight into where Jay wasn't right at the beginning. That ought to have shown we need to be searching for him in the inaccessible areas, not in the accessible areas. Number 3, identity. Identity is so important in true crime and in life. We didn't need to know Jay very well to know the broad strokes. He was young, immature, and reckless. He was also cognitively impaired due to sleep deprivation, dehydration, which only worsened, and potential intoxication. All of these, sleep deprivation, intoxication, and being cognitively impaired, are part and parcel of being young and immature. And take that into a wilderness setting that's got quite a lot of tricky areas and treacherous areas. Well, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? A lot could go wrong, and a lot did go wrong. Now, when we apply this same aspect, identity, to our own lives, we must necessarily ask ourselves whether our identities, in other words, our self-identity, obviously when you're an older person, you can decide who you are. Does that need fine-tuning? How does it need fine-tuning? Is it time that we set higher standards in a particular area, perhaps our own maturity? Is it time that we need to be more careful about getting enough sleep and what we put into our bodies as well, or how we think about things, or which creators we follow? And so in terms of Jay's identity, that took us kind of into 2 different directions. The one was his identity in terms of a foul play narrative, which some people focused on, and the other one was his identity in more general strokes, his capacity to be reckless and impulsive and spontaneous. And something I don't think I emphasized enough in the previous video, this whole thing was about Jay proving himself. He went out there, took a shortcut to prove himself, to show that he could get out of the situation that he got himself into. And in the process of trying to prove himself, what did he do? He disproved himself. And this actually happens to us a lot. This happens to us a lot. Number 4, context and environment. I believe this channel probably did the best job at trying to understand the context and the environment. Do you agree with that? Or did you find perhaps another channel that did it better? Thus, the psychological context needs to be identified, recovered, uncovered, pieced together, and explicated, and also the physical topography, which is also a kind of psychology attached to the landscape. And then the 2 need to be matched up. And where does that take us? And that's what I did. I've just done that with my analysis of Thomas Crooks and why he chose the target he chose. That's the previous video I put up. Context is an easy area to get wrong. In this case, you could have focused entirely on the Airbnb context, and it wouldn't have helped a jot. Or you could have advanced along the timeline and focused on the context immediately before Jay disappeared. Where was he? Which direction was he headed in? What was going on with him? What conversations did he have? And this would have helped you. Typically, the very last moments are the best evidence in a missing persons case. But it can get tricky. For example, if you're presented with dodgy final moments, such as the dubious ransom note in the Ramsey case, or the stage text no service in Yosemite in the Gabby Petito case, these, if you're not careful, can take you in the wrong direction. Now, a big part of getting this right was getting into Jay's shoes and getting the itchiness, to take a shortcut. getting a sense of that itchiness that he was feeling, that he didn't have a lot of time, that he didn't have any cell phone signal, and that he wanted to get his hotel. And that is how we stumbled upon the idea that Jay likely headed towards the sea because he saw the sea. And in general, he saw the sea as a symbol of where he needed to go. And for Jay, the symbol was right. Unfortunately, the context from which he was thinking about that symbol was all wrong. In the same way, we must be careful anchoring ourselves to symbols that drag us through unsuitable contexts. If that's the case, the symbol is treachery, and the symbol is the opposite of helpful. It's a lure.
It's undoubtedly a trap.
So for symbols to be effective, they need to operate in the right context. That brings us to timing and timeline. The timeline in this case was fairly straightforward. I won't be reviewing it here except to say it's important to get this part right. And the part of that is knowing when the timeline starts, and I guess to also some extent when it ends. Besides the timeline, in a missing persons case, one must also choose a moment to deliberately narrow one's perspective. Now, it's a fallacy to say that one must keep an open mind the whole time when one is investigating a missing persons case. Yes, there is a time to keep an open mind, and that's at the very beginning when one is still collecting and gathering information. What separates the men from the boys, the ace detective from the average Joes, is knowing when to begin to close some of the doors and windows in terms of those possibilities, because they are simply too unlikely, and begin to deliberately narrow one's focus and move in a particular direction. This doesn't mean closing one's mind, but simply starting to narrow our view, starting to move in a particular direction towards one set of probabilities and away from another set of mere possibilities. Now, again, this isn't being open or closed-minded, it's just being sensible and sensibly informed. Because a time absolutely does arrive when we do have to narrow our focus. Had search teams not narrowed their focus to inaccessible areas, let's say instead they'd continued to search in a broad, random, unfocused manner, or worse, started to search further afield, it may have taken countless months or even longer to find Jay, and perhaps he'd never have been found. The same applies in our own lives. Whether it happens when we decide what to study, what sort of jobs that we want, what kind of life we want, who to spend our lives with. Well, all of that is where we start to deliberately narrow our own options. That does have to happen at some point. Now, of course, if you narrow your thinking, but when you do it, this note is off, you are going to ruin your whole symphony. You could ruin your whole life, and you could ruin someone else's life. And one could argue that Neo ruined his life when he sort of woke up and found out that the world wasn't real. And so you might want to run away from ruining your whole symphony. But you want to live in the real world or some other world?
When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
And you may remember in the early days when I introduced this case to you, I warned many of you about exactly this, about one note being off and ruining the whole symphony. And guess what happened? That did happen to a whole bunch of people. And many of them still won't acknowledge that that note was off and that they've ruined the symphony. And so one does wonder, are there other notes that are off with these same people? Are their symphonies ruined in other senses as well? Because you do that, you end up fucking up your entire project, whether it's some personal journey you are on or in an investigative sense, as happened in the Madeleine McCann case and the John Benet Ramsey case. So when you focus, you need a high degree of certainty that where you are is sort of based on something that's educated, you anchored in reality, and also where you are going, does that make sense given what you know? And you might need to know a bit more to make sure that it does make sense. That brings us to final words and moments. What are the final words and moments in this case? If you decide that the final words or moments didn't happen in this case when they did, well, that's another way of one note is off ruining the whole symphony. That's a way of shooting the investigation in the foot. And I saw a frighteningly large number of people doing this. And what this shows is just how casual and dismissive people are of reality when it doesn't suit them. If that's you, Jay wasn't the only one who got lost in the mountains. You did too. And you could be in for a fall yourself. You know, you're going to face serious problems in your life if you don't realize you're lost to begin with, that your thinking is totally deluded to begin with as well. This idea that Jay's friends all lied and they should be suspects, I think speaks to the massive amount of distrust going on in social media. Now, I can tell you from a lot of personal experience, creators like to tell you, don't trust the authorities, don't trust the police, don't trust the media, because it implies they should be trusted. And what happens when you do? Time and again, their feckless ideas prove to be completely untrustworthy, but people continue to believe in them because it makes them feel like the world is a safe and easy place. And so they continue, and they are richly rewarded for this, for being bullshitters. Good luck with that strategy, suckers. And that then brings us to intertextuality. There was so much intertextuality surrounding this case, it was hard to avoid it. In fact, going into the Jay Slater case, we had the Michael Mosley case, same exact thing. Wrong turn, accident, accidental death in unfamiliar surroundings. Yet it didn't seem to make much of a difference to the amateur. This was a British man who went missing in Greece, I think it was Greece. And so the same people are now confronted with somebody else, and it didn't make much of a difference. It didn't make a difference to the amateurs. It didn't make much of a difference to the so-called experts who covered this case either. And that's quite worrying. You are shown something and you still don't learn from your mistakes. You're shown something again, still don't learn from your mistakes. Shown something again, still don't learn from your mistakes. Where do you think that journey is going to end? There were also many, many other current and less current examples similar to the Jay Slater case. Riley Strain, Kylie Rodney. The best evidence in both those cases were pings as well. I've covered many missing persons cases, especially in Britain. I've written books about missing persons cases. Experience ought to count for something. Does it? Does it count for something as far as you're concerned? Does it count for something in social media? Does it count for something in true crime? Does it? Do you expect your creators to have any kind of qualifications, any kind of experience, any kind of track record? Do you? It's interesting that no one in the British media ever contacted me, not once, during the past 5 weeks. And no one in the British media or in social media ever referred to me, as far as I know, not once. Now, that's no skin of my nose. It doesn't bother me. But it doesn't bode well for when all of this plays out again, because what it suggests is it's all going to happen again in exactly the same way. That's a kind of insanity. Hopefully the only difference is going to be those of you listening, those of you right now conscientiously taking notes, like Neo, will be newly awakened, critical thinkers out there taking true crime rocket science into the world and shaking up the fakers, wagging your fingers at the opportunists and the manipulators, ridiculing their fictions with proper analysis anchored in proper critical thinking. And that brings us to number 8. What in the counter-narrative does have merit? Well, the final stage when trying to figure out an investigation is giving credit to the counter-narrative where, if it is due, sometimes something isn't A or C, but B, a little bit of both. I do think Jay likely got drugs of some sort from one of the Airbnb dudes, which likely aggravated his already compromised state. But that isn't necessarily a foul play. That wouldn't make them culpable, but it would give them perhaps a sense of responsibility, and that they perhaps ought to have known that he could have been in trouble. And like Lucy, gone to some trouble to look for him. So we also need to think critically about thinking critically. And this is where Dunning-Kruger comes in, where even if you absolutely have the right to feel arrogantly confident of your position, or your rightness, this must be tempered by educating ourselves on what could be possibly but improbably wrong with it. And this leaves the door open to being a little open-minded to possibilities, even unlikely possibilities, even very late in one's analysis. I hope you've taken note of these 8 code breakers to approaching an investigation, but if not, here they are again. Number 1, statistics. 2, best evidence. 3, identity. 4, context and environment. 5, timeline and timing. 6, final words or moments. 7, intertextuality. And 8, what in the counter-narrative has merit. I'm not going to take it further than that, but again and again, when analyzing what we know and making inferences, we have to ask, does this make sense? In your own life, ask yourself, what am I doing? Does this make sense? We also have to be honest when we see that what we see, think, or feel doesn't make sense. We've got to be honest and say, well, you know what I'm doing doesn't actually make sense here. And from there, find our way to somewhere, a place of clearer cognition where we do make more sense of our common reality. I hope you guys will. I hope your lives will improve and those of the people around you as well. I think that is worth playing for, that is worth fighting for, that is worth striving for. Thank you for listening. Don't forget tomorrow's live where you can address some of your questions to me directly, and I'll see you guys next time.